And once again, I want to welcome you to Los Angeles Birders webinar for the first webinar for 2023. For all of you people who are members, thank you very much. You are helping make this possible to present this webinar, to present all the recordings on our website of past webinars. And it helps support field ornithology, community science projects, helps support lots of things. And so thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Tonight we have Julian. Oh shit.
I'm going to stop sharing, Julian. You can start sharing now.
Okay, Julian, go ahead.
Well, I'm supposed to introduce you.
Well, hold it, but first I'd like to introduce John Feenstra, who will introduce our guest speaker for tonight. John.
All right, very good. Who's now a nemesis of mine, who I didn't realize had that status, but originally from the UK. Julian spent most of his childhood years chasing rarities and worked briefly as a journalist on Britain's top-selling magazine Birdwatching.
All right.
Keen interest in identification and migration led to global wanderings on a shoestring budget, as many of us have. He spent his early 20s cutting his U.S. birding teeth in Cape May, New Jersey, as part of the 90s British invasion era. He left in the early 90s. If he stayed to the mid to late 90s, he would have seen a green-haired weirdo like me wandering around. He was involved in neotropical migration, counts for Cape May Bird Observatory, and spent a season as a research biologist at the Long Point Bird Observatory in Ontario, Canada. Although his background is in design and marketing, he has done some moonlighting as a professional bird guide for sunrise birding to places such as Alaska, Jamaica, China, and Uganda. As a talented artist, photographer, and writer, his work has been widely published in numerous European and American publications, and he recently produced the publicity art for the World Series of Birding, New Jersey, 2022. After 4 decades of globe-trotting adventures involving too many planes, trains, and automobiles, Julian now lives in New Haven with his son, Alex. So
still only 25.
Yeah, take it away. 4 decades and still only 25.
That's right. My math isn't very good, but thank you so much for inviting me. This is a pretty can be convoluted ID problems, especially for a lot of birders. So I'm going to try and run through this. But before we start, I just want to mention to the YouTube people that there is going to be a couple of quizzes and interactiveness throughout this. And because you won't be able to see some of the polling on the screen, you might want to get a pen and paper. Frank and Ron are going to put up some polls, and the answers to the questions are always going to be Pomarine, Parasitic, or Long-tailed Jaeger in that order. So as we get to the quizzes, hopefully you can interact and join in, and we'll go from there. So I'll just start off by saying that I think in the West, as it is in the East Coast, most of the Jaegers that do show up are generally offshore. Long-taileds being the species that occurs most out on the canyons and far out to sea, with Parasitic being the more inshore Jaeger, and Pomerine kind of alternating between inshore and offshore. So basically, I'm not really going to concentrate much on timing and migration. There is a lot to get through, and try and keep it as simple as possible. We're just going to kind of concentrate on the basic problems and hopefully the basic solutions to some of these. So this is just kind of hopefully an overview of these 3 species, Pomarine, Parasitic, and Long-tailed, which have caused identification headaches for birders for many years. So hopefully at the end of this, there'll be more enlightenment, hopefully, than confusion. As I said, it's a conundrum play bird watchers from beginner to expert. So it's no surprise if you do struggle with Jaeger identification. You really are not alone. So what are the main problems that cause Jaegers to be such a pain in the tush, so to speak? Well, usually they're seen out at sea. So unless you're on a pelagic, you're not usually able to come across them. Or you see them distantly, sea watching from land, where it's really difficult to see a lot of plumage features. And in migration, usually in the spring on pelagics from April till June, the northward passage as they head towards the breeding grounds. And again in fall when juveniles and adults are heading south from August onwards. The one main problem is every species is similar in all plumages. So a couple of the myths that you're likely to possibly hear as you become a birder and start to look at Jaegers, and especially growing up in the UK, a couple of things that I always heard on sea watches were that, you know, Poms were big and bulky, long-tails were small and turn-like, and parasitics, you know, always show more than 2 primary shafts, on and on and on. So here's a couple of things that kind of you might hear that actually are all true. But they're also all false. Not all Poms are barrel-chested, not all long-tails are small and turn-like. So there is a lot of overlap. And one of the main things is that before digital photography, as long as it kept going, its identity was whatever you wanted it to be, as long as it didn't come back. So that's kind of where we stood before digital photography. And now the main problems in the field is you have 2 kind of components to Jaeger ID. You have the in the field identification where you've seen the bird and generally you're looking at size and structure and flight action, which, you know, it is great with experience, but if you're a relative beginner and you haven't seen many Jaegers, trying to assess the size and structure of a lone bird can be really difficult. And even for experts that are identifying them at sea from boats, that can still give you a lot of problems. And with the advent of digital photography now, the second component to Jaeger identification is this kind of after the fact digital analysis where you can shoot a few frames. You've probably had a good field guess at what the bird is, and now you can check it on the back of the camera. It's like in the old days, except this is where the bird comes back to haunt you because there's digital images of it. What that has done, apart from humble a lot of bird watchers, is it has advanced what we know about Jaeger ID because it's allowed an after the fact analysis of things that are really hard to see in the field on a boat. You know, how many primary shafts did it have? What was the barring on the undertail like? And this is just a real big advantage now. What we're going to concentrate today, now we've looked at some of the problems and possible solutions, is that we're going to look at a couple of age classes that cause the most identification issues. And to keep it simple, we're just going to concentrate on 1-year-old birds that were born, say, the previous year, that are reaching the first plumage now that you could see in July and August. And on August pelagics, especially with early migrants like long-tailed Jaegers, you're also seeing juveniles. So by the time September comes around, you can be seeing 1-year-old birds and juveniles of the year. And we're just going to concentrate on those 2 species, sorry, 2 age classes, and try and keep it simple because a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about tonight hold true across most of those plumages. So here's the first quiz. Couple of quizzes here just to kind of get a baseline of where everybody thinks they may or may not be. And hopefully, if they get these right, I can just end the talk right here. But hopefully, if you get them wrong, it's not about getting it wrong. It's about honing in and identifying what did I look at that was important, or what did I not look at that was important. And hopefully at the end of this talk, you'll have a clear idea that when you do see a Jaeger, what are the things I need to key into that may make a successful identification afterwards, even if you don't do it at that time. So I'll leave this here for a minute, and I think
and I'm
Ron's
launching,
going to do a poll.
and I just launched the quiz or the poll.
And this is the same bird. I just included a sitting at the top left.
And we're getting lots and lots of answers in. They're coming in really fast at the moment.
You want to read the question and the answers
Oh.
for the YouTube?
Yes, the question is simple. What Jaeger is this? The answers are always the same: Pomerine, Parasitic, or Long-tailed, in that order. So what Jaeger is this? So far we have 29 answers. We'll get a few more in, and we can take it from there. In the meantime, Mark, do you have another Pomerine joke? Never mind. Okay, and here we go.
You have to believe I got the ID right. So,
okay, we have about 40 answers in, so I'm going to end the poll. And here are the results, Julian.
So I think that this is good because everybody went for the most likely one. And do I have to tell you what it is?
Yeah, the people on YouTube don't see what this is.
Yeah, so I'll just, do you want me to read out that 63% said Pomerine, 34 said Parasitic, and 3% went for Long-tailed. It is in fact a Parasitic Jaeger.
Wow.
But there is no, this bird is very Pomerine-like, and I completely understand why people went for that. This is one of those birds that is a parasitic. It's got a nice sloping head. It's got sparse, rusty wash barring to the undertail here. And what happens in the fall with juveniles that are really well fed is that you can get some really big parasitics coming through and some small Pomerines. So this is actually a parasitic Jaeger from Utah that was taken from eBird. A lot of the pictures from here I did use from eBird with the credit. So I'm going to go on to the next one because I just had two. So this quiz, there's going to be two parts to this one. The first part, again, you're going to answer Pomerine, Parasitic, or Long-tailed for bird one on the left.
Correct. And for
Pomerine, Parasitic, and Long-tailed for the bird on the right, which is bird
correct.
2.
And here we go. Launching now. And there we go. And your answers are up. You might have to scroll for this second bird.
And also you can move the quiz box by clicking on the top of it, and you can pull it over so you can still see the images of the bird.
Yeah.
And the answers are flying in even as we speak.
Literally.
Literally. And Cecilia, the birds are simply on the presentation. So you should be able to see the presentation. She had a question.
Sure.
And while answers are coming in, if you have a question for Julian, you can pop it in the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. There's a button that says Q&A. That helps us keep track of all the questions that come through, so we don't.
Yeah,
lose track of
and on this one, if you get the right one correct, it'll definitely help you identify the left one.
Okay, so we're pushing 40 on both. So I'm going to end the poll now. And
So bird one is on the left, correct, Ron?
I'm sorry?
Bird one was the left one.
Correct. So here's the answers for you and for everyone.
Okay, so bird one, the left-hand bird of the two here, most people said 44% said Pomerine, 18% Parasitic, and 38% said long-tailed. The bird on the right, 56% said Pomerine, 31% said Parasitic, and 13% said long-tailed. So the bird on the left, and it was close here, is actually a long-tailed and not a Pomerine. The bird on the right is actually a Parasitic and not a Pomerine. So had you identified the bird on the right as a Parasitic, just on size here with long tails being smaller, it would have probably helped you identify that as a long-tailed. But these are tricky. Again, this is a big Parasitic. Now, one of the things that we'll go into, the bird on the left here that helps identify it as a long-tailed is this little nick here in the underwing. Its general shape. And since we now know this is a Parasitic on the right, the very small size here is another feature. So we'll go into a few more things that cover those features in more detail. And the bird on the right is a Parasitic. It's a big Parasitic. It's quite bulky. It does look as though it's got a big head and a big bill. But you'll notice that the rump here is quite uniform. There's 4 or 5 primary shafts here. And that's typically a Parasitic trait. So don't feel bad if you got these wrong. It's just a good idea to figure out, well, you know, what do I need to look at? And I think these two are a good idea of kind of directing people now into kind of what to look for that hopefully will improve their chances if we do this quiz towards the end, which there is, spoiler alert, we'll hopefully do a lot better. So what are the key features? For Jaeger identification, there's about 6 main things that we're going to concentrate that will really help you separate these confusing species out. The first that we've talked about, once you see in the field from a bow, is what we call jizz, which is the general impression, size and shape. It's how it flies. How big is it compared to a laughing gull? Is it small? Is it tern-like? It taps into all those field things that you can only see. And generally speaking, those are what are going to drive your identification when you first see them. But that can have its own pitfalls. And we'll go into that later. The bill and the head shape, the underwing flash, the number of pale primary shafts, central tail feather shape, and the pattern of the upper tail and under tail barring are all important. So I'll go through these features. They can be variable, just as anything is with Jaegers. There isn't really any one particular thing that's diagnostic. So we're going to go look at those individually now. So for general impression, size and shape, one of the things that really causes issues is that females average much bigger than males. So if you get a big long-tailed and a small Arctic, you know, male and female, or you get you know, a female Parasitic and a male Pomerine, what you see out on a bow, what you're judging on on size and shape can be dramatically altered if the bird's a male or a female. This overlap obviously really is a challenge when you're identifying birds on a boat. You're only going by gestalt and how the bird looks compared to a herring gull or to a tern. And this misperception is 100% responsible for the ID issues that generally you see on a pelagic, where you're just identifying birds by size and shape. Flight style and behavior. Again, this is pretty, it's a guide. It's not a hard and fast rule, but generally the parasitics that you see inshore, they're very, very persistent. They harass terns and gulls in a very falcon-like acrobatic way. A lot more acrobatic than a Pomerine, perhaps, which is more gull-like, steady. They do harass birds, but generally Pomerines are more aggressive to the point where they'll actually attack the bird and kill it sometimes, whereas a parasitic will often get the bird to disgorge its food in a kleptoparasitic manner, which they're famous for. And long-tailed are very buoyant and tern-like. And I do find I kind of put a lot of stock in this last one. On a lot of long-tails I've seen, if the bird looks very Arctic tern-like, very bull-necked, and its body goes up and down, and it's got very tern-like wings, I often find that's a good indicator that the bird's probably going to be a long-tailed. Only Pomerines kill and eat Canada geese. I'm just joking there. That was a bit of a bad joke, but they don't.
It wasn't bad.
Do that, yeah. So, sorry. One of the key features of the 6 that we mentioned, bill and head shape. So, on the left is a Pomerine here. This is the bigger, bulkier bird. And to me, it always reminds me of a glaucous skull. They have this kind of blocky square head, typically a thick parallel-sided bill that's somewhat often a bit tapered because it's broader at the base. They have these pale eye rings, again, with a slight dark loral area, which kind of gives it this kind of gull-like expression to me. Generally, the head is uniform and smooth. Often it can appear a little bit kind of scaly, but it generally lacks any streaking. The parasitic in the middle, these tend to have kind of a slimmer bill, no obvious eye rings here, and often the cheeks and the rear crown are very, very noticeably streaked, which you don't see in a Pomerine. Long-tailed tend to be shorter and stouter build. Typically, if you look in the field guide, there's a lot of attention drawn to the black on the bill. With long-tailed having a shorter bill, the black often tends to make up half of the bill, whereas on parasitic, the black tip makes up a third of the bill, and on Pomerine, again, it's closer to a third. But I find this somewhat ambiguous in a lot of birds, but I do find it obvious that if you see a bird with a short bill, like this long-tail where the black is halfway occupying the bill, it tends to be a fairly consistent long-tailed field mark. Again, they do vary, but long-tails tend to have, like parasitics, slightly streaked ear coverts, and often pale eye rings, whereas I don't often see parasitics with obvious pale eye rings. It's something I've noticed in a lot of photographs. It's definitely worth something to keep in mind. Head and bill shape. This is a juvenile Pomerine Jaeger, and you can see here the really quite heavy bill that is quite tapered, typical of Pomerines. You can see a couple of primary shafts here, but generally speaking, it's a bulky bird with a pale bill and a dark low. So sometimes at a distance, the bill can look very, very pale base with a very delineated dark tip. One of the strange things in the East and the West Coast, Pomerine Jaegers, especially juveniles, they do tend to occur in some of the Great Lakes area. These are birds that are coming down through the center. But one of the curious things about juvenile Pomerine Jaegers in particular is they tend to be quite a late migrant, occurring in October and November. So often if you're out on a pelagic and you do get a Jaeger and you have aged it correctly as a juvenile and not a 1-year-old, it's probably going to be always the issue of separating a juvenile parasitic from a juvenile long-tailed, because juvenile Pomerines are so unusual in fall. We still don't know where these Pomerines go in big numbers in juvenile plumage. They probably go way offshore. They probably migrate late into the season, late October, early November, when a lot of the organized pelagic trips on the East Coast, presumably on the West Coast, have kind of wrapped up for the season. So it is unusual. It seems to be more of an identification issue if you live in the central part of the states around the Great Lakes, which do seem to get quite a larger number of juvenile Pomerine Jaegers. So that's kind of more of a conundrum in certain parts of the country. Still on head and bill shape differences compared to the Pomerine that I just showed you. This is a parasitic. It's got that very typical triangular shaped, disproportionately small head. It's got kind of a medium bill, not very short. The bill here, the black occupies like a third. And here we have head and bill shapes of the last confusion species. And I chose this slide. This is taken off the East Coast of Massachusetts last August. And you'll notice straight away the difference in bill shapes on these two. This is kind of a stout bill bird here, which is typical classic long-tailed. And then the bird on the left, if you didn't know this was a long-tailed, essentially it's got quite a parasitic-like look to its head. One of the other things is parasitic and long-tailed are said to have a difference in the tips to the primaries. Parasitics typically show pale tips to the primaries and long-tails don't. But as you can see here, that's kind of a misnomer. All three species can show some pale fringing to the primaries. It's typically parasitic that shows the broadest, most boldest tips, but each of those three species can show some pale fringes to the primary tips. So it's always good to kind of bear that in mind. And again, kind of take stock of several different features as you look at them. These are two different morphs too, which we won't get into. But one of the things about Jaegers, especially in juvenile plumage, is they kind of come in all different flavors. You have pale blonde ones to dark ones to intermediate ones. And basically here we have a light morph juvenile and a dark morph juvenile, and you can get any kind of flavor in between. So again, you can see the pale one has got all these beautiful, intricate notchings on the greater coverts here and tertials, whereas the dark bird is kind of uniform and you know, kind of pretty much lacks those. Underwing flash, one of the most obvious things to see in the field that we get kind of drawn into is looking at the underwing. And basically Again, this is very variable, and I'm just going to show you some kind of typical examples here of long-tailed, parasitic, and pomerine. And these kind of hold true whether the bird is a juvenile or a 1-year-old. It's pretty much the same. The feather tracks are still the same. So this pattern holds true for most of the birds you're going to see in July and August. So you can see here, and I'm going to make this black and white just to accentuate the differences here. One of the key things that I noticed years ago on pelagics out west, it's probably going back 10 years now, and people have noticed it independently. It's not any new thing. But on long-tailed, they have on this outermost primary this little notch here formed by the dark of the feather extending all the way to the base in many juvenile long-taileds. And while it's kind of variable, if you do see a bird with this notch in the primaries here, I'd be kind of thinking along the lines that this is a long-tailed as opposed to any of the other two species. One of the other things on the underwing flash on a Pomerine that you'll see mentioned is that they have two flashes formed by the tail bases to the greater coverts, and these are referred to as boomerangs. I often take it with a grain of salt because not all Pomerines show this feature very well, but when you do get a bird that does show a boomerang like this, you can kind of put your bets on that it's probably a Pomerine. But again, I haven't seen too many juveniles off the East Coast that show this all the time, but it is something to bear in mind if you are looking at a bird, to kind of look to see if it has this pattern. As I said, all these features that we're talking about are variable across all three species to the point where, again, it's not good to put all your eggs in one basket and hone in on one particular feature because they do vary so much. And I find it's better to kind of take stock of those 6 things that I mentioned and kind of at the end, make it a sum of all those parts. So as we've said, just go back, you know, long-tailed has this notch. Parasitic tends to have kind of a broad, obvious, big underwing flash like a Pomerine. But then you end up with birds like this. This is a long-tailed. It lacks the P10 notch. It's got an underwing flash as big as a parasitic. This bird on the right here is kind of a bulky parasitic, probably a female. It's got quite a thick bill and bulky body. But you can see this long-tailed here has kind of a bigger flash as you'll see. You can see the 2 primary shafts here, which is characteristic of many long-tails. Again, it does vary. Usually they'll show 2, probably 3. But if you see a bird that's got more than 2 like this, and it's a juvenile, it's probably not a long-tailed. But I just put this slide in to show you just how big an underwing flash a young long-tail can have. One of the 6 things we talked about was tail feather shape, the central tail feather shape. Typically on juveniles, and we're going to concentrate specifically on juveniles now because 1-year-old birds typically have these central tail feathers worn very thin if they've not molted them by the time they're 1-year-old. So central tail feather shape we're just going to use as it applies to juveniles. So it's obviously important to age them. And in the fall, juveniles of all 3 species tend to have these slightly elongated central tail feathers you can see here. Pomerines tend to be very short, blunt, and square-ended. Parasitics tend to be slightly pointed, and long-tails tend to be the most projecting of them all and are often termed rounded. And to me, I find this very, very difficult sometimes to assess in the field, especially on a flying bird. Are those central tail feathers pointed? Are they slightly rounded? Are they slightly pointed? It can be really difficult, but generally speaking, I find that long-taileds tend to have the most characteristic central tail projections. They also seem to be, as the name implies, quite long-tailed. And what I mean by that is the distance from the back of the wing to the end of the central tail projection often looks disproportionately longer compared to the base of the wing. So they almost look American kestrel-like, for use of a better word, whereas parasitics tend to be more balanced in that regard. Pomerines here, you can tell, quite a bulky, thick-set bird, which is typical of Pomerine. And also this one does hint at the slightly double boomerang that I mentioned. Parasitic shows this nice underwing flash. And again, you can see this slight dark notch here, which had we not talked about it previously, you'd be looking at that and thinking, that's probably a long-tailed, and it is. So again, one of the things about that is tail feather shape can appear variable. This is a bird that was photographed in Florida by Alex Lamoureux. It is in fact a long-tailed Jaeger. There's several other great photographs that he has of this on eBird. But if you look at these central tail feathers here, which being a long-tailed should be described as rounded if we go by the field guides, it's very, very similar to this parasitic. There's not much difference. And again, this just goes to show on certain views or certain photographs, it can be hard to determine if those central tail feathers are actually pointed or slightly rounded. So now we've covered 6 main features that we should key into. I'm just going to go through each species right now and go over the main features that are described in the field guides that actually are helpful. Parasitic is, again, best described as having kind of a spiky, somewhat medium-sized bill, kind of a small head. They're typically a rufusy brown in color. Any Jaeger you see with a very bright cinnamony buff fringes, especially on the primary tips we talked about. These are very chevron-like, very bold and obvious. The upper and undertail barring on the middle bird here is not very prominent and not very contrasting. It kind of blends in with the rest of the plumage. It's got 4 or 5 primary shafts here, rufusy kind of nape band, and again in flight, kind of a medium looking Jaeger, well balanced, kind of a small triangular head. You can see here the bill doesn't look quite big at all. It does have kind of a noticeable central tail projection, and again, it's really hard on a boat if you were to see this, and I included these pictures on the right as kind of a more distant view to give you a better idea of what really stands out in the field and what doesn't. And you'd be hard pressed if you just had to concentrate on that bird and say, well, is that a pointed central tail feather shape or a rounded central tail feather shape? But really, the things to take away from parasitics are that they're basically laughing gull sized. They have a very, very warm rufusy plumage to them. Not in all plumage morphs, but if you do see one that looks very rufusy brown in the wing coverts, you probably should be thinking parasitic Jaeger. And the upper tail and undertail barring is typically rusty buff and not very ladder-like. Again, Pomerine Jaegers, not often seen in this plumage in the East. I don't think I've ever seen a juvenile plumaged Pomerine Jaeger in North America. I've only ever seen one in my life. That was back home in England. They just seem to be an age class that is quite unusual and rare. And I do believe off Monterey and the mid-west coast, if you do get some storms, especially in late October, you can get some decent passages of juveniles. And again, so what would you be looking for off the West Coast? If Pomerine Jaeger is on the menu and it's late September, October, November, you do have to eliminate Pomerine Jaeger. So again, these are typically, if we're going to go with kind of typical birds, the bulky, they have this very strong, deep keel look to them. Again, they remind me of a glaucous skull. They have that blocky look with kind of a unmarked head and these pale eye rings with a dark lower. Often the dark laural area helps to accentuate the pale bill with the dark tip. And you can kind of see that in the middle bird here, which is a darker individual juvenile Pomerine Jaeger. You can see how that bill at a distance really stands out as being pale with a dark tip because of its thickness. Typically parasitics, because the bill is slimmer, at a distance, it kind of blends into the background because it's quite weak. Again, the head is unstreaked, typically cold gray-brown. Some juveniles do have this kind of mealy, scaly look to the head, almost reptilian-like, but they're not ever streaked like a parasitic or streaked on the cheeks like a long-tailed. The tail projections typically don't stand out a lot on a lot of birds, but when they do, they tend to be quite broader and blunter. As you can see on the bird on the right, this is kind of one of those classic individuals that does show that nice pale boomerang here, where it has that second little crescent formed by the greater coverts. And you can see the nice kind of smooth body color there, which is kind of like this dark milk chocolate brown. One of the things then to look for, again, strangely outside the Great Lakes, juvenile Pomerine Jaegers can be unusual, and therefore most of the time, I think the default identification is going to be between Arctic, sorry, I'm slipped into English speak there, parasitic and long-tailed. Pomerines, if you see them at sea, these will be the birds that you often mistake for a herring gull. They have a kind of a slow, purposeful flight. And if you see a Jaeger, or you see a bird that you think is a gull that turns out to be a Jaeger, I'd be thinking along the lines of Pomerine at that point. Unlike parasitic, they tend to show primaries that do not have any obvious pale tips, though some juveniles can show very, very thin pale fringes to the primaries. So I often look at the primary tips and decide if there's any pale fringes there. They also tend to have a lot of unmarked greater coverts here with not a lot of internal markings like those two juvenile longtails we showed. And the upper wing flashes, it's hard to see here, they tend to show 4 or 5 narrow pale primary shafts. Final one, long-tailed Jaeger. In the field, these tend to be small birds. If they're attacking terns or laughing gulls, they'll often be slightly smaller or the same size as a laughing gull. They have kind of a deep keel, a deep chest to them. They have typically a cold plumage. They can go from very, very pale blonde looking birds to very dark birds, but they typically lack that cinnamon turmeric tone that parasitics have, and a lot of pale barring on the back here. So it gives them a very cold gray-brown look. Again, this deep keel that they have, the center of gravity tends to be just under the nape, and it gives them kind of a very nice pear-shaped body where all the weight tends to be up the front end of the bird. And I think for me, it's even though the flight style is very turn-like and buoyant when you see them in the field, often when you look at them in pictures like this that are static, the actual physical proportions of a long-tail with this heavy, deep chest, sometimes a short, thick bill, can really give it a more Pomerine look to it. And I think, although these are the smallest Jaeger and Pomerines are the biggest, bulkiest, most powerful Jaeger, it's strange that in static photos, sometimes the identification, as we've just seen in the quiz earlier on, a lot of debate can be entered into about the bird is a long-tailed or a Pomerine rather than a parasitic and a Pomerine, or a parasitic and a long-tailed. And I find that quite fascinating. But here on these flying shots, you can see the upper tail coverts are prominently barred, unlike a parasitic, especially on the flying bird. You'll notice this at a distance. And the classic thing here is these 2 to 3 primary shafts. While pale primary shafts vary across all 3 species, if you do see a bird that clearly only has 2 primary shafts like this bird, you would probably be betting money that it's a long-tailed. We talk about various flavors, and I wanted to put this together to show kind of how similar these 3 species are in dark morph plumage. And I think it helps illustrate a couple of points if you do see a dark morph bird. So again, some of the things that we need to be looking at, we need to be keen into how many pale primary shafts do each of these birds show? What's the size and shape of the central tail feathers, the barring on the rump, the shape of the head and bill, and the bill structure, especially as it relates to how much does the dark tip occupy. And again, although these are variable, they do in total usually point you in the right direction. So as you can see, if you were to see a juvenile Jaeger in September, October, and it was a dark bird, what would you be keen into here? So as we've seen, if we look at the bill shape, the bird on the left is long-tailed, stubby bill, half of it being dark. Again, it goes to show how difficult it is to discern the actual central tail feather shape, because if you were to tell me these were blunt and rounded, I would have to disagree with you. They don't look blunt and rounded to me in this particular shot. So again, it is tough. The parasitic in the center, you can see it's got that nice spiky bill with a nice pale neck collar, which a lot of dark long-tails show, but Pomerines tend to always lack a pale neckband in juvenile plumage, typically being more uniform on the head. They can be a little bit mealy back there that can kind of give a hint of a pale neckband, but if you see one with a very discernible neckband, it's probably a parasitic or a long-tailed. Again, the primary shafts just being 2 hold true here. And this bird being dark, the upper tail coverts aren't as well barred as they are in some paler morphs. One of the things you can see on this Pomerine is it does have that thick neck, blunt, kind of very thick bill that gives it kind of a very brutish look. But again, on a flyby, this will be a very tough identification. We talked about 1-year-olds, the other age class that if you go out on a pelagic in July or August, you're going to see some of these 1-year-old birds that have headed back into the North Atlantic or the Pacific to kind of summer out at sea here. And you will come across these in late summer and early fall. And these are quite distinct from juveniles in that sometimes the central tail feathers are very, very worn and pointed. 1-year-old long-tailed and parasitics tend to achieve a more adult-like look to them in that they, by the time they're 1 year old, they've got quite a cap look with an obvious breastband. And Pomerines tend to be quite pale. If they have any central tail feathers, they're very, very, slightly broader or lacking. So as this bird here, you can see is kind of almost doesn't show any central tail feather projections. It does have the nice boomerang, but again, you can see the very, very hefty gull-like bill on this bird, which is kind of classic Pomerine. But these can be tough, as we talked about earlier. If we check the underwing flash, here you can see that nice, distinct kind of chip in the underwing flash here caused by the dark penetrating all the way to the base of the feather. That's a good indication, but it's a long-tailed. That's what it is. You can check out the bill shape. It tends to have a slightly shorter bill than this, but again, really tough and variable to kind of hang your hat on. But basically, if you see birds like this with slightly paler bellies and a well-defined breastband and cap, these are typically 1 year old birds, and again can be identified by much of the same features that we've mentioned for juveniles. Much is to be learned about Jaeger molts, since they occur mostly at sea, away from many birders. It's hard to kind of get a nice, well-defined look at how these birds molt, and it's great that many pelagics are going offshore now in July and August. It's given us opportunities to really study and photograph these birds and really learn and kind of key into some of the features that might be useful. But some 1 year old Jaegers, especially long-tailed and parasitic, as you can see in this picture, can be really, really hard to identify. And sometimes you're going to get it wrong, and sometimes you just have to let them go as Jaeger spur. And I always used to think that, I could put a name to everything. And it's been humbling now with digital photography to kind of identify something from a bow, only to check the back of the camera later and find out it wasn't exactly what you thought it was. So now we've run through a couple of those main features. We're just going to get into a bit of a quiz section here, and we're going to go through these silhouettes. So for each of these 5 silhouettes, you're going to again pick whether you think it's a Pomerine, parasitic, or long-tailed. So for quiz 1, especially for the YouTube people there, so silhouette 1, you're going to pick whether you think it's a Pomerine, parasitic, or long-tailed, and you're going to do the same for all of them. And I'll let Ron take over this part.
Okay, here you go. Don't forget to scroll down for image 2, 3, 4, and 5. And you're all set. Go ahead, and you can answer now.
As you're looking at these, just remember to key into the Giz and Gestalt points that we talked about. Where is the center of gravity on the bird? Does it look blunt-tailed? Does it look pointy-tailed? Does it look slim-winged? And you're just going to give it your best guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, needless to say, there's a bit more time with these 5 images needed, so.
You're kinder than me, Ron.
I'm sorry?
You're kinder than me. We can pretend these birds are circling the boat.
Exactly, there you go.
Yeah.
And you're feeling kind of queasy, wondering where you left those crackers.
There's a well-documented story that I've heard, and I've seen it repeated on the interwebs. Debbie Shearwater, who's kind of pioneered a lot of the pelagics out of California. I've taken a few trips with Debbie, and you know, she's allowed a lot of birders to get out and see a lot of amazing seabirds. And I think she recalls telling a tale where a Jaeger flew down one side of the boat, came back and flew down the other side of the boat, and it was identified as all three species. So even if that's not true, it's a great example to kind of illustrate how difficult these birds can be, especially when, you know, size overlaps between the sexes. But, you know, you just got to go on the best you can do, you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. The answers are rolling in, but it's a slower roll with all these images, but that's good. We're about halfway through everyone that's on the webinar. So that's pretty good.
Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting also because behavior is a really powerful tool for identification. And you're talking about how difficult it is, or how different it is to identify from images rather than with behavior is involved.
Yeah, and I found on pelagics that I've been on, you know, parasitics are quite relentless. They're the ones that are really, you know, harass a bird for quite a long time. Pomerines will do the same. They tend to kind of be a little more short-lived. You know, it's kind of a sprint. They're the one. If you see a Jaeger actually like sitting and killing a kittiwake, like I've seen them doing in the UK, you can pretty much assume that's a Pomerine Jaeger. And I've rarely seen long-tails do a lot of kleptoparrotism. Typically, what I've seen long-tails do is they may harass a tern, but often I don't see them chasing anything, especially not in the acrobatic manner that parasitics do. And that's not to say they won't, but one particular key behavior that I haven't mentioned that I find really helpful on long-tails is they kind of engage in this dip feeding technique, almost like a marsh tern, which you won't see parasitics or Pomerine doing. So if you do get a Jaeger that's kind of dropping down and taking small prey or fish off the surface of the water, that's a really good indicator to me that it's a long-tailed.
Yeah, kind of like a northern harrier, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Or you know, like a black tern is probably the
yeah.
to me, or a little gull, you know.
Yeah.
If anybody's ever watched those, you know, they kind of hover over the surface and then they'll just drop. Or like a Ross's gull.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
A marsh tern equals black tern. Okay, thank you. There we go.
Sorry, yeah,
Black
sorry.
tern.
Yeah. Again, slipping into British speak. Yeah, we refer to all those white-winged, whiskered black terns as marsh terns, so to speak.
Okay, here we go. It looks like the answers have stopped coming in, so let me share the results with you. And you can take it from there. There you go.
Somebody all right over there? All right. So
okay, there we go.
So number one is a long-tailed. 45% went for long-tailed and 48 went for parasitic. Again, on this one, I would look at the central tail feather projection there. Kind of blunt and rounded.
I'm sorry, Julian. Apparently someone has their mic open. If you can please mute, we'd appreciate it. If you're not named Julian, please mute.
Number two is a Pomerine. 84% went for Pomerine and 10% parasitic and 6% for long-tailed. That is good to see. We're getting there. That's awesome. Number 3 is a tough one. And I picked it specifically to make it difficult. It is, in fact, a Pomerine. 32% went for Pomerine, 45% went for Parasitic, and 23% went for long-tailed. It does look very long-tailed in this pose because you can't really see the bill, and the length of the tail and projections look kind of similar to number 1. So if people went for long-tailed on this one, I completely understand it, but it is in fact a Pomerine for those who went for Pomerine or Pomarine, however you like to call it. Number 4, 13% went for Pomerine, 35% went for Parasitic, and 52% went for long-tailed. It was, in fact, a Parasitic. One of the things, a couple of things to key into here, just on the silhouette. The very disproportionately small triangular shaped head with a medium-sized bill, kind of a pointy kind of tail here, which kind of hints at a more pointed central tail feather shape, and kind of a slim body with not much kind of gravity anywhere in particular. The wings are quite thin. It is very long tail like, but again, it does go to show how difficult it is to kind of identify birds on size and structure. But the thing you should be looking for on 4 in this one would have been the tail here and kind of the proportions of the head to the body. So number 5, 29% went for Pomerine, 39% went for Parasitic, and 32% went for long-tailed. So not many people went for Pomerine, which is good. It's either Parasitic or long-tailed, and you've got to decide at this point, you know, what does the head and bill and wing structure speak to you? It is, in fact, a long-tailed. So those that went for long-tailed over Parasitic, and there wasn't much difference here. It was a good split. You got the 2 choices, but it is, in fact, a long-tailed. And it is actually that bird I showed earlier on that was the long-tail that had the very big, broad underwing flash. This is actually a silhouette of that. So that just kind of helps to sum up the size and structure. And I made these silhouettes to kind of take color and plumage pattern kind of off the table here. So what we're going to do now, this is the fun part, which hopefully will kind of bring all the things that we've mentioned together and go through a few more quizzes and use them to kind of hone in on some of the features that we've talked about. And hopefully this will kind of help cement what to look for and what's helpful and what's not. So again, what we're going to do now is, for those people on YouTube, there's 6 quiz birds that we're going to show. And again, the answer is Pomerine, Parasitic, or long-tailed in that order. And after Ron has put up the answer, I'll go through quiz number 1.
Here you go is quiz D, and oh, I see you have quiz. Okay, so it's D1.
Yep.
There we go. Okay.
So there's 6 of these, and you know, I'll talk a little bit about each for 5 minutes. So we've probably got
and so
while 20 minutes.
While you're talking about this, Julian, people can go ahead and put their answer into D1, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I guess you're going to leave this poll up and people can scroll down.
Yes, I will.
So let me ask you a question then. Do I have to go through all 6 for them? I can see 6 on the screen. Are we going to do one at a time, or do I have to go through the quizzes?
You can do it any way you wish.
Well, if I go to the next slide, it's going to reveal what it is.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
So,
I could stop sharing after you finish talking about bird number 1. And then share the poll again, I believe, for bird number 2.
yeah, because I've got the poll screen on here, but I can see all 6. So
Okay,
I
yes.
wasn't sure if a poll was going to come on each time I got to a quiz.
Okay, no, I'll end the poll after you finish bird number 1.
Okay.
Okay, so at this point, people can answer as to bird number 1, D1.
I can't submit.
Oh,
You can't submit unless you answer all of them.
okay.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Diego. Okay, I can quickly put up a new poll. Let me end this poll. And I believe I can create a new poll quickly. In the meantime, can someone tell a Jaeger joke?
I'm all out of Jaeger jokes.
Yeah, I'm out of Jaeger jokes. I told them at the beginning.
Oh, yeah. I have to
I
admit.
mean, I could tell a Corvid joke.
Okay,
Where
Corvid,
where
sure.
was this bird seen? Is it East Coast, West Coast? Is it in a month? Do you recall?
So all these are going to be in the time frame of July to September. I've kept all the birds related to juveniles or 1-year-olds taken in July to September or October. So all these are going to be either juvenile or 1-year-olds in the fall. So I've tried to keep them to individuals that we've talked about in the plumages that we've discussed, which is juvenile and the occasional 1-year-old. So you don't need to be kind of determining whether this is an adult or not, because we're going to go through that in part 2. So all these quizzes are relating to juvenile Jaegers that you're likely to see between July and October.
Okay.
And is there a difference in distribution of these on the East and West Coast? You seem for palms, the juveniles seem to be more of a West Coast or Central. Is there any difference for long-tail or parasitic by coast?
Obviously, I can speak more to the East Coast than I can to the West Coast, but from what I understand, again, the distribution is, August is typically juvenile long-tailed Jaeger time. They're very early migrants. They leave their breeding grounds late July. So you can see juvenile long-taileds off the East Coast as early as mid-August. So that's one of the other key things is, if you have aged the bird correctly as a juvenile and you know that it's a bird of the year and it's early August, I would be thinking along the lines of long-tail more than parasitic. Once you get into September, odds are off between parasitic and long-tailed. And as we've mentioned, Pomerines tend to be quite unusual. And if they do occur, they're typically a later bird in October, November, perhaps the last few days of September if weather's bad. But generally speaking, if you're on a pelagic and you have to identify a juvenile Jaeger, it's probably going to be either, is it a long-tailed or is it a parasitic for the most part? Once you get into October, then you have to factor Pomerine in. Same with the East Coast. We do not see juvenile Pomerine Jaegers in the East. It's a mystery, especially when you consider sometimes the big passages of Jaegers you do get, multiple long-tails, multiple parasitics, just maybe one or two Pomerines. I do know in bad weather conditions in the West Coast, you have seen some movements in late fall. But again, I'm probably not the best person to kind of sum up the status and distribution of Pomerines, especially juveniles in the West and Northwest. So do you want me to go through quiz one?
Yeah. Sorry, let me go
gonna-
to quiz one.
I'm going to
Okay,
go through
I
these
can
relatively quickly.
Yeah, let me end the poll, and here are the results for quiz one. You got it?
I have it.
All right.
So Pomerine, parasitic, and long-tailed. So 19 went for Pomerine, 27 went for parasitic, and the majority at 54% went for long-tailed. It is no, it's a long-tailed. You got it right. So that's really good. Not an easy bird. This is a very parasitic-like long-tailed Jaeger. So everybody did really well on this. I'm hoping people picked up on it. Didn't have a lot of pale fringing to the primaries. You can see here the undertail covert barring, which is very zebra-like, classic long-tailed. But the bill and head shape, very ambiguous to me. It doesn't have that disproportionately small triangular shaped head of a parasitic. Doesn't seem to have that overly stubby billed, round-headed look of a long-tailed. So this is not an easy bird on this. So knowing that it wasn't an easy bird, I included another picture here of this so people didn't know I was lying. In flight, this is classic long-tailed. Look at this really deep keel here going into a nice pear-shaped body. Two primary shafts, and you can see the barring showing pretty well here. It's not as pronouncedly black and white as some. It's got kind of nice buff to it. But this shape, this very pear-shaped, attenuated shape here with these two primary shafts is classic long-tailed. So well done.
Okay, great.
Quiz two.
I got all my quizzes done, so let me put this out again, and here's quiz two. There we go. Stop here.
Again, all these are juvenile or one-year-old birds in fall. I'm not trying to trick anybody by throwing in different plumages. So all the features and identification tips that we were looking at, head and bill shape, underwing flash, pale tips to the primaries, streaking on the head, all apply equally to these quiz birds, and these will probably help get you to where you need to be. Some are not easy, so don't be kind of disillusioned if you get them wrong.
Well, this one is apparently a bit easier than the last.
Allegedly.
Uh-oh. The answers came in pretty quickly on this one.
Okay.
And let's give everyone a few more seconds. And here we go. We're ending the poll. And here are the results.
Right, for the YouTube people, I'll just carry on reading them out. So 18% went for Pomerine, 79% went for parasitic, and only 4% went for long-tailed. So the good thing that I'm seeing on these quizzes that makes me happy is we're seeing a big disparity now in what people are identifying these at. And it seems to be that most people are percentage wise going for one species over the other, which means that I think, you know, people are doing well. So 79% went for parasitic, and basically that's what this bird is. Again, a very, very warm toned bird, very, very well defined streaks on the ear coverts and nape, very broad, obvious chevron pale tips to the primaries here, all kind of combine to make this kind of a pretty slam dunk parasitic. The bill does look kind of spiky, but again, I find sometimes judging bill shape to be pretty ambiguous in some photos. But again, it is one thing to kind of add into the equation. So everybody did really well there.
Okay. Here's number 3. Quiz number 3 is up, and people are answering. Everything's rolling in. Again, if you have a question for the end, please pop it into the Q&A section.
And if you've got any complaints, just speak to Ron.
Yes. I'm excellent at handling complaints. Just ask my wife. And let's give everyone a couple more seconds to get their answers in. And with that, here are the, oh, we still have answers are still flying in here.
Flying in.
Flying in.
Again.
Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And here are the results.
So for those YouTubers, 44% went for Pomerine, 31% for Parasitic, and 25% for Long-tailed. And the overwhelming majority that went for Pomerine are, in fact, correct. This is a juvenile Pomerine Jaeger. Obviously, this bird has a huge, this is one of those barrel-chested Pomerines that actually is barrel-chested. It's got a big bruiser gull-like feel to it. It's got a big, thick, glaucus-like gull with these parallel-sided bill. It's quite deep-based. It's kind of smooth and uniform gray-brown here. The head looks unmarked. Like long-tailed, Pomerines typically also tend to have very, very well-marked under-tail coverts here. Even broader dark bars than a long-tail. It creates this zebra-like pattern here, which is worth looking at. Tail is hard to make out. I chose this because I didn't want the central tail feathers to kind of sway anybody. And structurally, this is kind of a brute of a Pomerine. So well done, everybody who got that right.
All right. Okay, quiz D4 is now up.
Sometimes in the fall, either sick birds or birds that kind of are found resting on beaches, especially after hurricanes in the east. Sometimes if we get a hurricane in late August, we'll get a couple of Jaegers. Connecticut's not very good for seabirds being landlocked, but we do hope that bad weather does force birds inland. So, you know, it's not surprising to come across Jaegers on a beach. So again, for those at home, concentrate on those things that we talked about, you know, look at the primary fringing, the cheeks, the bill shape, color. Again, not saying this is easy.
Nope, it's been a minute. Please get your answers in. And we're going to stop the quizzing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, here we go. And here's the results.
So for 7% went for Pomerine, an overwhelming majority went for Parasitic at 69, and 24% went for Long-tailed. And although the overwhelming majority went for Parasitic, is in fact a long-tailed Jaeger. This is a tough one. As I said, long-taileds like Parasitic can have streaked cheeks. There really isn't any obvious pale fringing to the primaries, but there is some very narrow, indistinct pale tips here, which can be shown by long-tailed. The overall color is kind of warm on the back here, again, but it's not very cinnamony looking. The bill is kind of ambiguous, and overall, this is really a tough bird. So if you identified this as a parasitic, completely understandable. There is a lot more photos by Phil Gregory that do show this in flight, and it is a parasitic. It is a long-tailed.
Great.
So quiz 5.
Bird 5. And bird 5 is now up. Again, the answers are either Pomerine, Parasitic, or long-tailed in that order.
Again, the first question to ask yourself is, what age is it? Again, we're still talking about July, August, September, possibly October. So it's either going to be a juvenile or a 1-year-old, so you should be looking at things like, does it have a cap? Does it have a breastband? Are they obvious? What are the tail feathers like? Age it first, and then use some of the information we've talked about to kind of hone in on specific features.
And the answers are flying in. Let's give everyone a few more seconds.
Again, the features that you're going to use are still the same, whether the bird's a 1-year-old Jaeger or a juvenile. For the most part, you're still going to be using the same features. It'll still help you get to an identification. But it's just good practice to try and age Jaegers in the field, improve your birding skills and knowledge.
Okay, it looks like the answers have slowed down, and we're going to end. Oh, we're okay, 5. Let's give them 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, and 1. And here are the results.
So an overwhelming majority went for parasitic on this one. And you would be right. This is a 1-year-old parasitic. As you can see, these very needle-like tail streamers here, never shown by juveniles in July and August and September. They have those nice rounded ones. It's getting the cap and breastband that is quite typical of 1-year-old parasitic and long-tailed Jaegers and Pomerines to some extent. But one other feature here, and we'll talk about this in the adults, is that this little white frontal blaze here, while it looks like kind of a missing patch of feathers, is very, very often diagnostic when present of parasitic. So if you do find, it's never really shown by 1-year-old longtails. So if you do see a 1-year-old bird that has this little white blaze in front of the eye, you should be thinking along the lines of parasitic. All the tail primary shafts here, way too many for a long-tailed. even though 1-year-old parasitics this year tend to have that more defined barring here. This is just wear coming in, but these central tail feathers here identify as a 1-year-old. But it's this white blaze, big white underwing flash, 5 or 6 primary shafts, and a bill that is kind of, again, medium, ambiguous, could be either or, but most people went for parasitic and got it right.
All right.
So I
Final
know we've run a bit late. I try to keep it short and sweet, but hopefully people enjoyed the interactive part of it. So what have we learned? We've learned that Jaegers causes headaches.
Oops. Sorry about that.
When we're identifying them in the field, we usually go for a gut reaction based on structure, flight style, behavior, because that's usually all we can see on a boat or at a distance. We can't really see a lot of plumage features. So even though it does overlap and can lead to mistakes if you're just going on size and structure, it's the only thing to go on. And generally speaking, you'll use that and then try and key on a couple of field marks to help kind of cement the first impression you get in the field was the correct one. Digital images allow more forensic analysis after the fact. It's really hard to get out of the habit now with everybody having a digital camera to straight away take pictures of a Jaeger and then identify it after. And for me, it's hard not to do it, but what it does is it kind of leads to a missed opportunity to really kind of look at the bird and study it while you can. It's good if you just snap a couple of images, but look at these birds that are flying around the boat. Try and get a good grasp and feel for flight style, behavior, and jizz and size and structure, because that'll go a long way to kind of helping your Jaeger identification. But some can be really tough and will only be identified by a close scrutiny of digital images after the bird's gone. The conventional field marks that we've talked about, bill size and structure, underwing barring, upper tail, undertail barring, wing flash, all those conventional field marks that are mentioned in the book are helpful, but they're also variable across all 3 species, and don't kind of hang your hat on any one in particular. The underwing pattern that we've talked about for long-tailed, if present, you probably do well there to call it a long-tailed. But I always find that I facilitate between one and another because Jaegers are tough, and even experts just kind of scratch their head with some of them. It's a really tough family of birds to identify, and that's just it. At the end of the day, I think if you get to a correct identification, it's going to be based on a suite of characters that we just talked about, and that's all, folks. I think everybody did really well on the quizzes at the end, which kind of showed to me that I think people were kind of keying in on a couple of field marks. So I hope everybody has kind of ended better than they started with what to look for. So thank you so much for tuning in, and to Ron, Mark, John, Andy, and Frank for facilitating this. But I know it's getting late, but if people want to ask a question, I'll be happy to answer it. Just let me know what I need to do.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was fantastic. The quizzes really help a lot because it really just drives it home.
Yeah. Instead of just having me waffle on in my unintelligible English accent, and people are like, "What is he talking about?" Like Dick Van Dyke from Mary Poppins. I want my money back.
I
can't see
questions. Please put them in the Q&A.
Yeah,
I don't see any at the moment.
No,
they've had enough, Mark.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've gotten several comments. Thank you, Julian, for a wonderful presentation.
Yeah, you get to come back in 2 weeks and go through it all again.
Yeah,
Yeah, for the adults, that's great.
but the adults are much better,
And
right?
in the meantime, a whole bunch of us are going to be on a boat on the 23rd, I guess it is.
21st, second,
Yeah.
first,
I
second,
don't know, do you,
23rd.
do you see many
So-
Jaegers in winter other than
And-
Pomerine out on the west coast? We don't see any Jaegers here, really.
Yeah, it's probably going to mostly be Pomerine, but
I don't go outside in January, especially not on a boat.
Yeah,
I can't see the chat on my screen in case I need to respond. To
John
anybody.
Feenstra indicates mostly palms and sometimes parasitics. So we have a pretty good chance of seeing something out there.
Good.
Yeah, well, thank you, Julian. That was really great. That was a real tour de force of identification of these young Jaegers. So
Yeah,
thank you.
and
Absolutely.
thanks for tuning in. And like I said, if anybody has any comments about if it was helpful the way it was presented or not, it's always helpful to me to kind of, at the end of the day, what I want to do is kind of present a complex identification issue, hopefully in a visual way that helps people kind of take away something. I mean, my goal is for people to kind of take away something from this, even if it's only knowing what to look for, whether they got them right or wrong. That's not the goal here. The goal here is to know what to look for in order to advance. And the only way you're going to do that is to know what to look for. And if you keep doing that with all the Jaegers you see, ultimately after a while, you will become a better birder. So thanks for tuning in.
And also, I just want to mention to everyone, we are actually going to leave this video up for a few days. So you have an opportunity to go back and go over some of those parts that weren't quite clear to you, or you had to run out and get a cup of coffee during, or whichever. So you have that opportunity. It's great. And Julian, thank you very, very much. Next week, don't forget, we'll have a wonderful webinar on what is it, Frank? I'm sorry.
it's on smoke.
Oh,
Yes,
thank you.
it's looking at the effects of wildfire, smoke, and other on identification, on really detection and bird behavior, and sort of the threats of increasing threats of wildfires on bird behavior.
Fantastic. And then
Then in 2 weeks, then Julian is back.
Exactly.
You know what? If it keeps going like this, it's almost Wednesday for me right now. I might as well just stay on and get it done now.
well, if you don't mind, we're off.
No, great to meet
Okay,
everybody,
okay.
and have a wonderful day. So I don't know. Do I stop sharing? What do I do?
You
I
can
just stay
stop
on?
sharing, and I'll end the webinar in 1 second after saying good night to everyone. And have a wonderful evening. We
Good night,
will
everyone.
see you next week, and hopefully out in the field.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone. We'll
Bye.
see you later.